The carriage wheels stopped outside Ashworth Cottage just as thunder cracked over the hills, and Eleanor Ashworth felt her heart drop the moment she saw the black crest on the carriage door. No one arrived at her door with that crest unless something terrible had happened, or something terrible was about to. She had barely finished pulling her shawl over her shoulders when the front door opened without a knock, and a tall man stepped into her small sitting room like he owned it. His coat was soaked from the rain, his jaw was set hard, and his eyes swept the room the way a soldier studies a battlefield before deciding where to strike. Eleanor knew him at once, though she had never stood this close to him before: Duke Damien Ravenscourt. The man half the county called cold and the other half called dangerous. Men lowered their voices when they spoke his name at dinner parties. Women crossed the street when his carriage passed. It was said he had buried his father, his brother, and any softness he once carried, all before his 30th year. "Lady Ashworth," he said, his voice low and even, giving nothing away, "forgive the hour, my matter cannot wait for polite ones." Eleanor straightened her spine, refusing to let him see how her hands trembled. She had buried a husband 18 months ago, and grief had taught her one useful lesson: nothing that arrived without warning ever brought good news. "Your Grace," she said carefully, "I cannot imagine what business a duke has with a widow in a cottage with a leaking roof." A ghost of something crossed his face, not quite a smile, more like the shadow where a smile might have once lived. "I have come to ask something of you that will sound absurd," he said. "I ask that you hear the whole of it before you refuse me." Eleanor gestured to the chair across from her own, more out of habit than hospitality. He did not sit. He stood near the window instead, watching the rain slide down the glass as if it were easier to speak to the storm than to her face. "My grandmother is dying," he said. "The physicians give her perhaps 2 months, perhaps less. Before she goes, she wishes to see me settled, married. It is the one wish she has asked of me in 30 years, and I intend to grant it, in form if not in truth." Eleanor's breath caught. "You want a wife?" "I want the appearance of one," he corrected. "A fiancé, someone who can stand beside me at the estate, charm my grandmother, and hold off a cousin who has been circling my inheritance like a vulture waiting for a corpse. In exchange, I will settle any debt you carry, and pay you a sum large enough that you need never worry about a roof again." The words landed heavier than the thunder outside. Eleanor thought of the letters stacked in her writing desk, the ones from her late husband's creditors, growing more threatening by the week. She thought of the way the butcher had begun asking for coin before handing over the meat, the way her maid Clara had not been paid properly in a month, the way winter was coming and the roof truly did leak, right above the spot where she now stood. "Why me?" she asked. "There must be 100 women in London who would leap at the chance to wear your ring, even a false one." "Because you do not want anything from me beyond the arrangement," Damien said simply. "Every other woman I might ask would want it to become real. You have no reason to want that. You buried a husband you loved. You have no interest in trapping a duke into marriage. That makes you the only woman I trust enough to ask." Eleanor almost laughed at the strange compliment hidden inside the insult. He had just told her in the same breath that he trusted her because he assumed she could never love him. "And if I refuse?" "Then I will thank you for your time and trouble you no further," he said. "But I do not think you will refuse, Lady Ashworth. I think you have already counted the coins in that desk drawer and found them wanting." Anger flared in her chest, sharp and sudden, because he was right, and because he had clearly done his research before ever knocking on her door. She wanted to tell him to leave. She wanted to tell him that her grief was not a bargaining chip, that her hardship was not an invitation for a stranger to walk into her home and offer to buy her dignity. But the roof dripped steadily behind her, a small, relentless reminder of exactly how little choice she truly had. 3 months, she said finally. "You said your grandmother has 2 months, perhaps less. I will give you 3 in case you are wrong. After that, the engagement ends quietly and I return to my life." "Agreed," Damien said, and something in his shoulders eased, as though he had been holding his breath since he stepped through her door. "I will send a carriage for you at first light. My household will require preparation, so I imagine will you." He turned to leave, then paused at the door, glancing back at her with an expression she could not read. "One condition of my own," he said. "Whatever passes between us at Ravenscourt Hall, whatever anyone believes they see, you must remember it is not real. I do not intend for either of us to forget that." Eleanor lifted her chin, matching his coldness with her own. "I buried my heart with my husband, your grace. You need not worry about mine." He nodded once, satisfied, and stepped out into the storm. Elinor stood at the window and watched his carriage disappear down the muddy road, the crest on its door catching the last flash of lightning before the night swallowed it whole. She did not sleep that night. She sat by the fire with Clara, turning the strange bargain over in her mind, searching for the trap she was certain must be hidden somewhere inside it. Clara, ever practical, only shook her head and said that a debt paid was a debt paid, whatever the reason behind it. "He is called the most feared man in the county," Clara said, setting a chipped teacup in front of her mistress. "Feared men do not usually beg widows for favors, my lady. Something is not right about this." "Nothing about it is right," Elinor agreed. "But nothing about my life has been right since Edmund died. Perhaps it is time I stopped expecting rightness and started expecting survival instead." She thought of her husband then, of Edmund's easy laugh and his habit of humming while he worked in the garden, and of the terrible morning she had found him collapsed near the stable, gone before the physician even arrived. The coroner had called it his heart. Something had never sat easily with Elinor about that explanation, a small splinter of doubt she had buried alongside her grief because there had been no strength left in her to question it. She pushed the thought away now, the way she always did, and focused instead on the carriage that would arrive at dawn. When morning came, gray and quiet after the storm, Elinor packed a single trunk with the dresses she still owned that had not been sold or mended past recognition. She dressed carefully, not for vanity but for armor. If she was going to walk into the home of the most feared duke in England and pretend to be the woman he loved, she intended to walk in looking like she belonged there. The carriage arrived exactly as promised, sleek and black, with the Ravenscourt crest gleaming even under the dull morning sky. A footman helped her inside without a word, and as the wheels began to turn, carrying her away from the only home she had known since her marriage, Elinor allowed herself one final look back at the cottage with the leaking roof. She did not know yet that she would never truly return to the woman she had been when she left it. The road to Ravenscourt Hall wound through hills thick with old oak trees, the kind that had stood witness to centuries of secrets long before Elinor Ashworth was born. She watched the countryside change through the carriage window, the cottages growing sparser, the land growing wilder, until finally the trees opened and the hall itself rose into view. It was larger than she had imagined, gray stone against a graying sky, with towers on either end that looked older than the rest of the structure, as if the house had grown outward from some ancient, stubborn root. Elinor felt something tighten in her chest at the sight of it, not quite fear, but close enough to it that she pressed a hand flat against her ribs and reminded herself to breathe. The carriage rolled to a stop in the courtyard, and before the footman could reach the door, it opened from the other side. Damien stood there, dressed more formally than he had been the night before, his expression once again unreadable. "Lady Ashworth," he said, extending a hand to help her down, "welcome to Ravenscourt Hall." She placed her hand in his, and for one strange moment the contact sent an unexpected warmth up her arm, gone as quickly as it had come. She told herself it meant nothing. Cold hands simply noticed warm ones, that was all. "It's larger than I expected," she admitted, looking up at the towers. "It is colder than it looks, inside and out," Damien said, with something almost like humor in his voice. "I hope you brought warm dresses, and a thicker skin than the one you wore last night." Before she could respond, the great front doors opened, and a line of servants filed out to greet them, their faces carefully neutral in a way that told Elinor they had been trained not to show curiosity, even though curiosity was written plainly in every pair of eyes that studied her. At the front of the line stood an older woman with silver hair pinned severely back, and a younger man with a nervous twitch at the corner of his mouth. Damien introduced them briefly: the housekeeper, Mrs. Fenwick, the butler, Mr. Simmons. Elinor greeted them both with the warmest smile she could manage, aware that every servant in that courtyard would soon be whispering about the new lady of the house, whether that title was true or not. As she was led up the front steps, Elinor noticed something odd. Every servant glanced, however briefly, toward the western wing of the house, a section with dark windows and ivy climbing thick over the stone, as though the wing had been abandoned entirely. She noticed, too, the way their glances slid away just as quickly, as if looking too long might invite something they did not wish to invite. "What is kept in the western wing?" she asked quietly, once they were inside and the servants had dispersed to their duties. Damien's jaw tightened. the first genuine reaction she had seen from him since the carriage. "Nothing that concerns you," he said. "I would ask that you stay away from it for your own comfort." "For my comfort or for yours?" He did not answer. He only led her deeper into the house, past portraits of stern ancestors and long hallways lit by tall windows, until they reached a sitting room where a fire already crackled in the hearth. "You will have the blue chamber upstairs," he said. "Clara has already been sent for and should arrive by evening with the rest of your belongings. My grandmother will wish to meet you tomorrow. I would ask that you rest today and prepare yourself. She is sharper than most physicians twice her age, and she will know within a moment if something is false." Elinor felt a flicker of nerves at that, though she kept her face composed. "I have grown quite good at appearing calm, Your Grace, even when I am not." "So have I," Damien said, and for the first time since she had met him, his voice carried something that sounded almost like weariness, almost like an apology for the burden he was asking her to carry. "It is, I have found, the only skill this family has ever truly valued." He left her then, and Elinor stood alone in the sitting room, staring into the fire, wondering exactly what kind of house she had agreed to live in, and exactly what kind of man she had agreed to pretend to love. That evening, after Clara arrived with the last of Elinor's belongings and had settled her into the blue chamber, Elinor could not sleep. She wandered the upstairs hallway in her dressing gown, drawn by nothing but restlessness, and found herself standing at the end of the corridor that led toward the western wing. A single candle burned in a sconce nearby, flickering against the closed door at the hallway's end. She told herself she would only look. She would not touch the door. She would not step closer than she already had. But as she stood there, she heard something faint drift from behind that door. A voice, low and pained, speaking words she could not quite make out, and beneath it, unmistakably, the sound of someone weeping. Elinor's hand had barely lifted toward the handle when a voice behind her made her jump. "I told you to stay away from there." She turned to find Damien standing at the other end of the hallway, his expression carved from stone, his eyes fixed not on her, but on the closed door behind her, as though it were an old wound he could not stop pressing. "I heard someone," Elinor said, "someone crying." "You heard the wind," Damien said flatly. "This house is old, it makes sounds that mean nothing." She did not believe him, not entirely, but something in his voice told her this was not a conversation she would win tonight. She nodded once, and let him walk her back toward the blue chamber in silence, the sound of that unseen voice still echoing faintly in her mind long after her door had closed behind her. Whatever secret Ravenscourt Hall was hiding behind that locked door, Elinor understood, with sudden and unshakable certainty, that her arrangement with the Duke had just become far more complicated than a simple exchange of coin for pretense. Morning came with a strange kind of silence over Ravenscourt Hall, the sort that follows a storm, though no rain had fallen. Elinor rose early, unable to shake the memory of the weeping voice from the western wing, and dressed with extra care, knowing that today she would meet the woman whose approval could decide the fate of the entire arrangement. Clara helped her into a deep green gown, brushing her hair until it shone, and offering quiet encouragement that Elinor badly needed. "You have faced worse than one old woman, my lady," Clara said. "You have faced grief and debt and a house with no roof to speak of. A dowager duchess is nothing compared to that." Elinor managed a small laugh, grateful for her maid's steady presence. "A dowager duchess who is sharper than most physicians, according to her grandson. I fear she will see straight through me before I have said a single word." "Then say your words carefully and let your eyes say the rest," Clara told her, and Elinor thought there was more wisdom in that simple advice than in anything the Duke himself had offered. She found Damien waiting in the corridor outside her chamber, dressed in dark blue that made his eyes look almost silver in the morning light. He studied her for a long moment, and something in his gaze softened just slightly, though he said nothing about her appearance. "My grandmother takes her morning tea in the east parlor," he said. "She does not like to be kept waiting, and she does not like flattery. Answer her honestly, or as honestly as our arrangement allows, and you will manage well enough. And if she asks how we met, how you proposed, we will say we met at a charity gathering in London last spring, and that I called on you privately soon after. It is close enough to believable that no one will think to question it." Elinor nodded, memorizing the details, though her stomach twisted with nerves as they walked together toward the east parlor. The closer they came, the more she noticed how Damien's posture changed, his shoulders squaring, his jaw setting, as though he were preparing to walk into battle rather than to visit his own grandmother over breakfast. The east parlor was warm and bright, sunlight pouring through tall windows onto a small round table set with delicate china. In a high-backed chair near the window sat an elderly woman, thin and pale, but with eyes so sharp and clear that Alina felt instantly and thoroughly examined the moment she stepped into the room. So, the woman said, before either of them could speak, "This is the widow who has finally caught my grandson's eye." "Grandmother," Damien said, his voice carrying a warmth Alina had not yet heard from him, "may I present Lady Alina Ashworth?" Alina curtsied, keeping her expression pleasant despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs. "Your Grace, it is an honor to meet you." "Sit," the Dowager Duchess said simply, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. "Let me look at you properly." Alina sat, folding her hands in her lap, and endured several long moments of silent study while the old woman's eyes moved over her face, her posture, her hands, as though reading a book written in a language only she understood. "You have a widow's eyes," the Dowager said finally. "Grief sits differently than most feelings. It does not fade the way people expect it to, it simply learns to hide better." "Yes, Your Grace," Alina said quietly, surprised by the accuracy of the observation. "I have found that to be true. And yet you have agreed to marry my grandson, who has grief of his own hiding in every corner of this house, though he would sooner die than admit it." The Dowager's gaze flicked briefly toward Damien, who stood rigid near the window, his expression carefully blank. "Tell me, Lady Ashworth, why him? Of all the men in England who might have offered a struggling widow security, why did you choose the one everyone else fears?" Alina felt the weight of the question settle over the room like a held breath. She glanced at Damien, saw the faintest flicker of warning in his eyes, and chose her next words with great care. "Perhaps," Alina said slowly, "because everyone else fears him, and I found myself curious as to why. Fear is often simply misunderstanding, wearing a heavier coat." Something shifted in the Dowager's expression, a crack of genuine surprise breaking through her carefully composed features. For a moment, Alina thought she saw the ghost of approval there, quickly hidden away again behind decades of practiced reserve. "A diplomatic answer," the Dowager said. "And perhaps buried somewhere inside it, an honest one as well. We shall see, Lady Ashworth, which of those two things proves true in the weeks to come." Breakfast continued with lighter conversation, though Alina remained acutely aware of the Dowager's continued study, of the way the old woman's gaze moved between her grandson and his supposed fiancé with quiet, calculating interest. By the time the meal ended, Alina felt as though she had passed through some manner of examination, though whether she had passed or merely survived remained unclear. As they left the parlor, Damien fell into step beside her, his expression thoughtful. "You handled her well," he said, "better than I expected." "Was that meant as a compliment, Your Grace?" "It was meant as the truth," he said. "I do not offer compliments I do not mean." They walked together through the long gallery, past more portraits of stern ancestors, and Alina found herself studying the paintings more closely this time, noticing the resemblance between Damien and several of the men staring down from their gilded frames. One portrait in particular caught her attention, a man with the same sharp jaw and cold eyes as Damien, though something in the painted expression made her shiver. "My father," Damien said, noticing where her gaze had settled, "the late Duke. He looks like you." "He looked like a great many things," Damien said, his voice suddenly distant. "Kindness was never one of them." Before Alina could ask what he meant, a commotion sounded from the front entrance, voices raised, footsteps hurrying. Damien's expression hardened instantly, and he moved toward the sound with the same coiled tension she had seen the night he first arrived at her cottage. They reached the entrance hall to find a well-dressed man standing just inside the door, shaking rain from his coat, a thin smile fixed on his face that did not reach his eyes. "Cousin," Damien said, his voice flat and cold, "I did not expect you until next week." "I thought I would arrive early," the man said smoothly, his gaze sliding toward Alina with open, unashamed interest. "I heard the most fascinating rumor in London, Damien, that you have finally taken a bride. Naturally, I had to see for myself whether the rumor was true, or whether it was simply another one of your convenient arrangements." Alina felt her pulse quicken at the words, though she kept her expression carefully composed. This, she understood immediately, was the cousin Damien had mentioned, Lord Julian Vane, the man circling the inheritance like a vulture waiting for a corpse. "Lady Ashworth," Damien said, his hand settling protectively at the small of her back, "allow me to introduce my cousin, Lord Julian Vane." Julian bowed with exaggerated grace, his eyes never quite leaving Alina's face. "A widow, I am told. How very convenient for my cousin. A woman who understands loss, and who therefore understands exactly how much a fortune can matter to a person left with nothing." The insult was wrapped so carefully in politeness that Alina almost missed it, but she felt its edge all the same, sharp and deliberate. She lifted her chin, refusing to let him see how the words landed. "Grief does teach certain lessons, my lord," she said evenly. "It teaches a person to recognize kindness when they find it, and to recognize its absence just as quickly." Julian's smile flickered just slightly before he recovered it. "How charming. Damien, you have found yourself a bride with a tongue as sharp as your own reputation. I look forward to watching this arrangement unfold." He swept past them without another word, heading toward the guest wing as though he already owned every stone of the house around him. Alina watched him go, a cold unease settling into her stomach. "He will try to prove this false," Damien said quietly, once his cousin had disappeared. "He will look for any crack in our story and widen it until the whole arrangement collapses." "Then we must give him no cracks to find," Alina said, surprising herself with the steadiness in her own voice. Damien turned to look at her, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. "You sound as though you intend to fight for this arrangement, Lady Ashworth, rather than simply endure it." Alina held his gaze, feeling the weight of the decision settle over her fully for the first time since she had left her cottage. "I did not come here to lose, your grace. Whatever else this arrangement may be, I do not intend to let your cousin win." Something shifted between them in that moment, quiet and unspoken, a fragile understanding neither of them dared to name aloud. Outside, the sky had begun to clear, sunlight breaking through the clouds over Ravenscourt Hall for the first time since Alina had arrived, though the danger gathering within its walls had only just begun. That night, unable to sleep once again, Alina sat by her window, watching moonlight spill silver across the courtyard below. She thought of the dowager's sharp eyes, of Julian's thin smile, of the weeping voice behind the locked door in the western wing, and of the strange, unwelcome warmth she had felt when Damien's hand rested against her back in the entrance hall. She reminded herself firmly that none of it was real. It could not be real. She had buried her heart once already, and she had no intention of digging it up again for a man who had made it perfectly clear, from their very first meeting, that pretending was all he had ever asked of her. But as she finally drifted toward sleep, the memory that lingered longest was not of Julian's threat, nor of the dowager's piercing gaze. It was of Damien's eyes, softening for just a moment in the morning light, and the strange, unfamiliar hope that had stirred quietly in her chest before she could stop it. The Dowager Duchess summoned them both to the East Parlor 3 days later, and this time her request carried the weight of a command rather than an invitation. Alina arrived to find the old woman seated straighter than usual, a folded letter resting on the table beside her tea, her expression unusually determined. "I have decided," the Dowager announced, before either of them could greet her, "that this household requires a formal engagement ball, 2 weeks from tonight. Every family of consequence within a day's ride will be invited, including my late husband's more troublesome relations." Damien's jaw tightened visibly. "Grandmother, that is not necessary." "It is entirely necessary," the Dowager said, fixing him with a look that silenced whatever protest he might have offered next. "I have watched this county whisper about you for years, Damien, cold, distant, unfeeling. I will not leave this earth while my grandson's name is spoken with pity or suspicion. A ball will settle every rumor at once, and I intend to see it done properly." Alina glanced at Damien, watching the muscle in his jaw work as he weighed his grandmother's words. She understood, without needing to be told, exactly what this meant for their arrangement. A private pretense between two people was manageable. A public performance in front of the entire county, under the watchful eyes of gossips and rivals alike, was something else entirely. 2 weeks is not much time to prepare a gown suitable for a duke's engagement ball, Alina said carefully, hoping to buy herself a moment to think. "Then we shall begin preparations today," the Dowager said, waving a hand as though the matter were already settled. "I have summoned a dressmaker from London. I have also arranged for a dance instructor, since I have watched my grandson dance exactly once in the past decade, and it was not an experience I wish to repeat in front of half the county. Damien exhaled slowly, clearly recognizing the futility of arguing further. As you wish, grandmother. Once the dowager had dismissed them, satisfied with her plans, Elinor followed Damien out into the corridor, her mind already racing through the implications of what had just been decided. A ball, she said quietly, with your cousin in attendance, no doubt, watching for any sign that our engagement is false. Julian would not miss such an opportunity for anything, Damien agreed grimly. He will study every glance, every touch, every word between us, searching for the crack he needs. Then we must ensure he finds none. Damien stopped walking and turned to face her fully, something serious settling into his expression. That will require more than careful words, Lady Ashworth. It will require the appearance of genuine affection, dancing. Conversation that looks intimate to those observing from a distance. I would understand entirely if that request troubles you. Elinor considered the warning hidden inside his words, the reminder that whatever passed between them at that ball would need to look convincingly real, even though both of them had agreed from the very beginning that none of it truly was. I have played more difficult roles than a happily engaged woman, Your Grace, she said, lifting her chin. I spent a full year after my husband's death pretending to strangers that I was managing perfectly well, when in truth I could barely rise from bed some mornings. I believe I can manage a ball. Something flickered across his face at her words, an expression she could not quite name, somewhere between admiration and concern. I am sorry, he said quietly, for what you endured after his passing. I did not intend to make light of it by asking this of you now. The unexpected gentleness in his voice caught her off guard, and for a moment, the careful distance she had maintained between them wavered. You did not make light of it, she said softly. You are the first person in a long while who has not tried to rush me past my grief and into forced cheerfulness. I find I appreciate that more than you likely realize. They stood there a moment longer in the quiet corridor, something unspoken passing between them, before Damien cleared his throat and gestured toward the staircase. The dance instructor will arrive within the hour, he said. I suggest we prepare ourselves for an uncomfortable afternoon. I have been told my dancing resembles a man attempting to fight off invisible enemies. Elinor laughed, a genuine sound that surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise him. Then I shall enjoy watching you battle those enemies, Your Grace, very much indeed. The dance lessons that followed over the next several days proved to be exactly as awkward as Damien had predicted, though not entirely in the way Elinor expected. He moved with more grace than his warning suggested, his hesitation rooted not in physical clumsiness, but in something deeper, a reluctance to hold another person close that seemed to run far beneath the surface of simple unfamiliarity with dancing. You hold yourself as though touching me will burn you, Elinor observed quietly during their third lesson as the instructor stepped away to adjust the music. Damien's hand tightened slightly at her waist, though his expression remained composed. I have not held a woman in a great many years, Lady Ashworth. Forgive me if the habit has grown unfamiliar. Not since your father passed. Something shadowed crossed his face. Not since long before that. Elinor wanted to press further, wanted to understand the source of the guarded pain she glimpsed so often behind his careful composure, but she sensed the boundary in his voice and chose not to cross it. Instead, she simply guided the conversation towards safer ground, and continued the lesson with patience that seemed to gradually ease the tension from his shoulders. By the end of the week, something had shifted between them, subtle but unmistakable. Their conversations grew longer, extending well past the boundaries of their lessons, drifting into quiet discussions over evening tea about books they had read, places they hoped to visit, and small memories from childhoods that had unfolded in very different kinds of households. Elinor learned that Damien had loved horses since boyhood, that he preferred the quiet of early mornings before the household woke, and that he carried a small, worn book of poetry in his coat pocket that he rarely mentioned to anyone. Damien learned that Elinor had once dreamed of traveling to Italy, that she hummed softly without realizing it when she was concentrating on needlework, and that her laugh, when genuine, carried a warmth that seemed to catch him off guard every single time he heard it. Neither of them spoke of what these small discoveries meant, nor of the way their careful arrangement seemed to be quietly transforming into something neither of them had planned for. But Elena found herself, more than once, catching Damien watching her across a room with an expression that looked nothing like the practiced indifference he wore in front of others, and she wondered, with growing unease, exactly how convincingly they were managing to fool everyone around them, including, perhaps, themselves. The night before the ball, Elena stood in her chamber as Clara made final adjustments to the deep sapphire gown the London dressmaker had delivered that afternoon. The fabric shimmered like water in the candlelight, and for a moment, Elena barely recognized her own reflection in the mirror. "You look every inch a duchess, my lady," Clara said softly. Elena studied her reflection, searching for the woman who had arrived at Ravenscourt Hall only weeks earlier, frightened and uncertain, and finding instead someone whose eyes had grown steadier, whose posture had grown more confident, though whether that confidence came from the gown or from something else entirely, she could not say. A soft knock sounded at her door, and when she opened it, she found Damien standing in the corridor, dressed formally for the evening ahead, though the ball itself was still hours away. "I wanted to speak with you before tomorrow," he said, privately away from prying ears. Elena stepped aside to let him in, though she left the door open behind him, mindful of appearances even in the relative privacy of her own chamber. "Tomorrow will be difficult," Damien said, his voice unusually careful. "Julian will watch us closely, and my grandmother will watch us more closely still. I need you to understand that whatever occurs during that ball, whatever I say or do to convince the room of our engagement, none of it is meant to overstep the boundaries you and I agreed upon." "I understand," Elena said quietly, though something in his words left her feeling strangely unsettled, as though he were reminding himself of the boundary as much as he was reminding her. Damien nodded, though he lingered a moment longer than necessary, his gaze moving over her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "You have made this arrangement far easier to bear than I expected, Lady Ashworth," he said finally. "I did not anticipate that." "Neither did I, Your Grace," Elena admitted softly. For a long moment neither of them spoke, the space between them charged with something neither had intended to create. Then Damien stepped back, clearing his throat, and offered a formal bow before retreating toward the door. "Rest well," he said. "Tomorrow we give the entire county a performance they will not soon forget." Elena closed the door behind him and pressed her back against it, her heart racing far more than any simple business arrangement should ever cause it to race. She thought of the boundary they had both agreed upon, the careful line between pretense and truth, and wondered with growing alarm exactly how much longer either of them would manage to keep both feet firmly planted on the correct side of it. The night of the ball arrived wrapped in golden candlelight and the low hum of 100 hushed conversations, every one of them, Elena suspected, circling the same subject. The great hall of Ravenscourt had been transformed, its usual cold grandeur softened by garlands of white flowers and the warm glow of 100 candles, though nothing could soften the sharp attention of the guests who filled it. Elena stood at the top of the grand staircase beside Damien, her hand resting lightly on his arm, and felt the weight of every eye in the room settle upon them as they descended together. Whispers rippled through the crowd like wind through tall grass, though she could not make out individual words, only the shape of curiosity and disbelief moving from guest to guest. "Smile," Damien murmured beside her, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear it. "They are searching for cracks, do not give them one." Elena lifted her chin and smiled exactly as he instructed, though her heart hammered wildly beneath the deep sapphire silk of her gown. They reached the bottom of the staircase, and the Dowager Duchess appeared almost immediately at their side, resplendent in deep plum velvet, her eyes gleaming with something that looked remarkably like triumph. "The county has talked of nothing else for a fortnight," the Dowager said quietly, "for their ears alone. Let us give them an evening worth talking about for a fortnight more." The evening unfolded in a whirl of introductions, curtsies, and careful conversation, Elena navigating each interaction with a composure she had not known she still possessed. She met earls and countesses, distant cousins and old family friends, each one studying her with poorly disguised curiosity, searching for some flaw in the story of the Duke and his sudden mysterious fiancée. Julian appeared just as the musicians began the first dance, dressed impeccably, his smile as sharp and calculated as ever. He approached with a glass of wine in hand, positioning himself close enough to Alina that she caught the faint scent of something bitter beneath his cologne. "Lady Ashworth," he said smoothly, "you look positively radiant this evening. Marriage, or the prospect of it, agrees with you." "Thank you, my lord," Alina replied evenly. "I find that happiness tends to show when a person is fortunate enough to feel it." "Happiness?" Julian repeated, his tone laced with something skeptical. "An interesting choice of word, considering how recently you buried a husband you were, by all accounts, deeply devoted to. Forgive my bluntness, but grief of that depth does not typically fade so quickly, nor so conveniently." Alina felt the barb land precisely where it was intended, but she held her expression steady, refusing to let him see how close he had come to a truth she had not yet fully examined herself. "Grief does not fade, my lord. It simply learns in time to make room for other feelings alongside it. I would not expect a man of your particular temperament to understand the distinction." Julian's smile thinned, though he recovered quickly, offering a shallow bow before moving off into the crowd, no doubt to seek other opportunities to sow doubt among the assembled guests. Damien appeared at her side moments later, having witnessed the exchange from across the room, his expression tight with barely concealed anger. "What did he say to you?" "Nothing I could not handle," Alina assured him, though her voice carried a slight tremor she could not quite suppress. "He is testing the foundation, exactly as you warned he would." "Come," Damien said, extending his hand, "let us give him something sturdier to test." He led her onto the dance floor as the musicians began a slow waltz, and for the length of that song, the crowded ballroom seemed to fade into a distant blur around them. Alina moved through the steps they had practiced so many times over the past 2 weeks, and found, to her surprise, that she no longer needed to think about them at all. Her body simply followed his lead, natural and unhesitating, as though they had danced together 1,000 times before this one. "You dance beautifully," Damien murmured, his hand warm against her waist. "The instructor would be proud." "You dance rather well yourself, your grace, for a man who claimed to fight invisible enemies." A genuine laugh escaped him, low and warm, catching the attention of several nearby guests who turned to watch with open curiosity. Alina realized with a small jolt of surprise that she had never before heard him laugh so freely, and that the sound of it did something strange and pleasant to the space beneath her ribs. "You make it remarkably easy to forget myself, Lady Ashworth," Damien said quietly, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made the crowded room around them feel suddenly very far away. "I find that both a comfort and a considerable problem." "Why a problem?" "Because forgetting myself was never part of our arrangement," he said softly, though his hand did not loosen at her waist, and his eyes did not look away from hers. The music swelled around them, and for one unguarded moment, Alina let herself simply exist inside the warmth of his gaze, forgetting, just as thoroughly as he had, the careful boundaries they had drawn between pretense and truth. It was only when the song ended, and the spell broke beneath the polite applause of the surrounding guests, that she remembered herself, stepping back with a composure that felt considerably harder to summon than it had only minutes before. Across the room, half hidden in the shadow of a marble column, Julian Vane watched the exchange with narrowed eyes, a slow, calculating smile spreading across his face, as though he had just glimpsed something far more useful to his purposes than any simple lie. 2 weeks after the ball, a storm rolled in from the coast, unlike any Alina had witnessed since arriving at Ravenscourt Hall. The wind tore at the old oaks lining the drive, and rain hammered the windows with such force that Clara insisted on lighting extra candles against the darkness, muttering nervously about the state of the roads. Alina had spent the afternoon in the small library reading, grateful for a quiet moment away from the watchful eyes that seemed to follow her everywhere since the ball. She had almost drifted into sleep over her book when a sharp cry echoed from somewhere deeper in the house, followed by the sound of hurried footsteps and raised voices. She rushed toward the noise and found Mrs. Fenwick standing near the kitchen stairs, her face pale with alarm. "It's young Thomas," the housekeeper said, "one of the stable boys. He's fallen from the hayloft in this wretched storm, and his leg is broken badly. The physician cannot reach us tonight. The bridge road has flooded." Alina did not hesitate. She had learned enough of tending injuries during Edmund's final illness to be of use, and she followed Mrs. Fenwick toward the servants' quarters, calling for clean linens and hot water as she went. Damien arrived moments later, soaked from checking the stables himself, his usual composure entirely stripped away by genuine concern. Together, they worked through the worst of the night, setting the boy's leg as best they could manage, keeping him calm and warm while the storm raged on outside. It was well past midnight before Thomas finally settled into an uneasy sleep, and Alina and Damien found themselves alone in the small servants' parlor, both exhausted, both soaked through from their efforts, neither quite ready to retreat to separate corners of the house while the storm still howled outside. "You handled that remarkably well," Damien said quietly, sinking into a worn chair near the fire. "Most ladies of your standing would have fainted at the sight of a broken bone." "I nursed my husband through the final months of his illness," Alina said, settling into the chair across from him. "I learned quickly that fainting solves nothing, and that someone must remain steady enough to act." Damien studied her for a long moment, firelight flickering across the sharp planes of his face. "You speak of him so rarely, your husband." Alina felt the familiar tightness in her chest that always accompanied thoughts of Edmund, though tonight, exhausted and stripped of her usual careful defenses, she found herself answering more openly than she intended. "He was kind," she said softly, "gentle in a world that did not often reward gentleness. We were not wealthy, but we were happy, or so I believed. And then one morning, I found him collapsed near the stable, and the physician called it his heart, and that was the end of everything I understood my life to be." "You do not sound entirely convinced by the physician's explanation." Alina looked up sharply, surprised by his perception. "No," she admitted quietly. "I have never been entirely convinced. Edmund had no history of illness. He was strong and careful, and there was a bruise near the back of his head that the physician dismissed as the result of his fall, though I always wondered if it happened before he fell, rather than because of it." Damien's expression grew unusually still, something guarded moving behind his eyes. "Did you ever pursue the matter further?" "I had no means to pursue anything," Alina said, a trace of old bitterness creeping into her voice. "A grieving widow with no fortune and no influential family carries very little weight when she suggests that a coroner's ruling might be incomplete. I was told to accept my grief and move forward, and eventually, exhausted and alone, I did exactly that." The fire crackled between them in the silence that followed, and Alina watched something complicated pass across Damien's face, an emotion she could not fully identify, though it looked uncomfortably close to guilt. "I am sorry," he said finally, "that you were made to carry that uncertainty alone." "And what of you?" Alina asked, deciding the storm and the late hour had earned her the right to press a little further than usual. "You spoke once of a father who ruled through fear rather than kindness. Is that why the western wing remains locked? Is that where he lived before he passed?" Damien's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Alina thought he would refuse to answer, retreating instead behind the careful walls he had built around himself long before she ever arrived at Ravenscourt Hall. But the storm outside seemed to loosen something in him as well, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a rawness she had not heard from him before. "My father was not a gentle man," he said slowly. "He ruled this house and everyone in it through fear, my mother included. She grew ill when I was young, though I have never fully believed her illness was entirely natural. My brother, Alistair, tried to protect her, tried to stand against my father in ways I was too young and too frightened to attempt myself. He died in a hunting accident when I was 17, though I have never fully believed that was natural either." Alina felt a chill move through her that had nothing to do with the storm outside. "You believe your father was responsible." "I believe my father was capable of far worse than most people ever imagined," Damien said quietly. "I have never proven it. I have spent years searching for proof and finding only silence, locked doors, and servants too frightened to speak. The western wing was his study, and later, in his final years, the room where he was kept, confined by illness and by choices he made that I have never fully understood. My mother's portrait hangs there still. I cannot bring myself to remove it, and I cannot bring myself to enter that room and face what remains of him inside it." Alina understood, suddenly and completely, the source of the weeping she had heard on her very first night at Ravenscourt Hall. Not a ghost, not the wind, but grief, old and unhealed, echoing through a house that had never truly been allowed to mourn properly. "That is why you are called the most feared man in the county," she said softly, understanding settling over her like a warm blanket against the cold outside. "Not because you are cruel, but because everyone assumes you carry your father's nature simply because you carry his name." Damien's eyes met hers, something vulnerable and unguarded flickering behind his usual composure. I have spent my entire life terrified that they are right to assume it, that whatever darkness lived inside my father lives inside me as well, waiting for the right circumstance to reveal itself. I do not believe that, Elinor said, surprising herself with the certainty in her own voice. I have watched you set a stable boy's broken leg with more gentleness than most physicians manage. I have watched you defend a widow's dignity against your own cousin's insults. Whatever darkness lived inside your father, Damien, I do not believe it lives inside you. It was the first time she had spoken his given name aloud, without the formal title attached, and the sound of it seemed to hang in the air between them, charged and significant. Damien rose from his chair and crossed the small distance separating them, kneeling beside hers, his eyes searching her face with an intensity that stole the breath from her lungs. "Elinor," he said quietly, testing her name the same way she had tested his, "I fear I am beginning to forget the terms of our arrangement entirely." "As am I," she admitted softly, her heart pounding wildly against her ribs. For a long, suspended moment, neither of them moved, the space between them thick with unspoken possibility. Then slowly, deliberately, Damien reached up and brushed a strand of hair away from her face, his fingers lingering against her cheek with a tenderness that undid every careful defense she had built since arriving at Ravenscourt Hall. "I promised you I would remember this was not real," he murmured. "I find I am no longer certain I can keep that promise." "Perhaps," Elinor whispered, "neither of us was ever truly meant to keep it." The storm raged on outside, but inside the small parlor, warmed by firelight and the fragile, trembling honesty that had grown between them, something far more dangerous than pretense had quietly and irrevocably taken root. The morning after the storm broke clear and bright, the fields around Ravenscourt Hall washed clean and glistening under a pale autumn sun. Elinor woke feeling strangely lighter than she had in months, though a quiet uncertainty lingered beneath that lightness, born from the memory of Damien's fingers against her cheek and the words neither of them had fully dared to speak. She found Clara waiting anxiously in her chamber, a folded note clutched in her hands. "This arrived for you an hour ago, my lady," Clara said, her expression troubled. "Delivered by a stranger who would not give his name. He asked that it be placed directly into your hands and no others." Elinor took the note with a growing sense of unease and unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was unfamiliar, sharp and slanted, and the words within sent a cold shiver down her spine. "I know what truly happened to your husband," the note read. "I know why the coroner's ruling never sat easily with you. If you value the truth and value your safety within these walls, meet me in the Eastern Garden at noon. Come alone." There was no signature, but Elinor did not need one to guess the sender. Only one person at Ravenscourt Hall had both the motive and the cruelty to send such a message, and his name was Julian Vane. She debated for the better part of an hour whether to tell Damien, weighing the risk of confronting Julian alone against the danger of drawing Damien into a confrontation that might expose the very cracks Julian had been searching for since his arrival. In the end, her own stubborn need for answers won out, and at noon she made her way alone to the Eastern Garden, her heart hammering with a mixture of fear and determination. Julian was waiting beneath a bare oak tree, his expression composed into something almost sympathetic, though Elinor had learned by now not to trust anything about his carefully arranged features. "Lady Ashworth," he said, inclining his head, "I wondered if curiosity would win out over caution. It usually does in my experience." "You claim to know something about my husband's death," Elinor said, refusing to waste time on pleasantries. "Speak plainly, or I will return to the house immediately." Julian's smile thinned, amusement flickering behind his eyes at her bluntness. "Very well, plainly then. Your husband, Edmund Ashworth, once worked as a land steward for a family whose business dealings occasionally required a certain flexibility with the truth. A family, Lady Ashworth, closely connected to the Ravenscourts." Elinor's breath caught. "What are you suggesting?" "I am suggesting," Julian said, his voice dropping lower, "that your husband may have discovered something he was never meant to discover, involving the late Duke's financial dealings, shortly before his unfortunate collapse. I am suggesting that the bruise you noticed, the one so conveniently dismissed by the coroner, may not have been an accident at all." The garden seemed to tilt beneath Elinor's feet, old doubts she had buried for 18 months rushing back to the surface with sickening force. How could you possibly know about the bruise? I told no one of that detail save Damien only 2 nights ago. Julian's expression flickered just briefly, and Alina realized with a fresh wave of unease exactly what that flicker meant. You have been listening at doors, she said slowly, understanding dawning. You overheard our conversation during the storm. I overhear a great many things in this house, Lady Ashworth, Julian said, unashamed. It is remarkably easy when the walls are old and the servants are loyal only to whoever pays them best. I heard enough of your conversation to understand that you harbor genuine suspicions about your husband's death, and enough about my late uncle's reputation to suspect those suspicions may be entirely justified. You are lying, Alina said, though her voice trembled with far less certainty than she wanted it to carry. You are simply trying to turn me against Damien, to poison whatever trust has grown between us, so that you might expose our engagement and claim the inheritance for yourself. Perhaps, Julian admitted, with an unsettling honesty that troubled her more than outright denial would have. Or perhaps I am the only person in this county willing to tell you the truth, rather than allowing you to fall further under the spell of a man whose family has a well-documented history of silencing anyone inconvenient to their interests. He stepped closer, lowering his voice further. Ask yourself this, Lady Ashworth. Why would a duke as guarded and private as Damien Ravenscourt choose, of all the women in England, a widow whose husband once worked closely with his family's business affairs? Coincidence seems an unlikely explanation, does it not? The question landed like a physical blow, and Alina found herself unable to answer, unable to fully dismiss the terrible possibility Julian had just planted in her mind. She thought of Damien's vague answer, weeks ago, when she had asked why he had chosen her specifically. Because you have no reason to want more than the arrangement offers. Had that answer concealed a darker truth she had been too eager to overlook? I do not believe you, she said finally, though the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. Damien is not his father. Perhaps not, Julian said, stepping back with a satisfied smile that told her he had accomplished exactly what he set out to accomplish. But blood carries more than a family name, Lady Ashworth. I would advise you to consider carefully what else it might carry, before you allow yourself to fall any further for a man whose family's secrets may be far darker than you currently understand. He left her standing alone beneath the bare oak tree, the cold autumn wind cutting through her cloak, though the chill she felt had little to do with the weather. She stood there for a long while, turning Julian's words over and over in her mind, searching for the lie within them and finding, to her growing horror, that she could not locate one with any real confidence. By the time she returned to the house, her earlier lightness had entirely vanished, replaced by a hollow, gnawing uncertainty that followed her through the remainder of the day like a shadow she could not outrun. Damien noticed the change in her almost immediately. He found her that evening in the library, staring blankly at a book she had not turned a single page of in over an hour, and his expression grew concerned the moment he saw her face. Alina, he said, crossing the room quickly, what has happened? You look as though you have seen a ghost. Perhaps I have, she said quietly, closing the book and setting it aside. Tell me something, Damien, and I need you to be entirely honest with me. Did your family have any dealings with my husband before his death? Any business connection to Edmund Ashworth at all? Damien's expression shifted, something guarded and troubled moving behind his eyes, and in that single unguarded moment, Alina felt her heart sink with dawning, terrible certainty. Where did you hear that name mentioned in connection to my family? He asked carefully. Answer my question first, Alina said, her voice sharper than she intended. Did you know my husband before you ever appeared at my cottage door? The silence that followed stretched long enough to answer the question entirely on its own. I did not know him personally, Damien said finally, his voice low and careful, but I knew his name, yes, before I ever came to your door. My father's estate records mention an Edmund Ashworth, a land steward who once managed a portion of our northern properties, several years before I inherited the title. Alina rose from her chair, her hands trembling, betrayal and confusion warring inside her chest. And you said nothing of this to me. You allowed me to believe our meeting was nothing more than chance and circumstance, when in truth you knew exactly who I was and exactly what connected me to your family, long before you ever knocked on my door. It was not chance, Damien admitted, his composure cracking further with every word. When I began searching for a woman suitable for this arrangement, my solicitor presented several names of widows in reduced circumstances who might be persuaded by a generous offer. Your name appeared among them, along with a note regarding your late husband's prior connection to my family's estate. I did not seek you out because of that connection, Eleanor, I swear it. I chose you because everything I later learned about your character convinced me you were exactly the woman I needed. That is not the same as honesty, Eleanor said, her voice shaking with barely contained anger. You have known this entire time that our lives were connected long before we ever met, and you allowed me to sit across from you, night after night, sharing pieces of my grief, without once mentioning that you already held pieces of the puzzle I have spent 18 months trying to solve. Damien stepped toward her, his expression pleading in a way she had never before witnessed from him. I did not withhold it to deceive you, Eleanor. I withheld it because I feared exactly this reaction, and because, until recently, I did not fully understand the significance of the connection myself. And do you understand it now? He hesitated, and that hesitation told her everything. My father's estate records are not entirely complete, Damien admitted slowly. There are gaps, missing pages, entire ledgers that appear to have been deliberately destroyed sometime after his death. I have spent years trying to piece together exactly what my father was involved in during his final years, and Edmund Ashworth's name appears briefly in one of the few surviving fragments, alongside a notation that troubled me greatly when I first discovered it. What notation? Damien's jaw tightened. A payment, a significant one made shortly before your husband's death, under circumstances my father never explained to anyone, including me. The room seemed to spin around Eleanor as the pieces Julian had planted in her mind that afternoon suddenly clicked into place with sickening clarity. A payment, she repeated numbly. For what purpose? Do not know, Damien said, his voice raw with what sounded like genuine anguish. I have searched for years to understand what my father was capable of, what he may have ordered done in the final months of his life, and I have found only fragments, never enough to form a complete picture. When I learned of your husband's death and the timing of that payment, I feared the worst, Eleanor. I feared that my own father may have been responsible in some way for the very grief that brought you to this house. And still you said nothing, Eleanor said, her voice breaking. You brought me here, into your home, knowing I might be living beside the very family responsible for my husband's death, and you allowed me to grow close to you without ever once giving me the choice to walk away with full knowledge of the truth. I was afraid, Damien admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Afraid that if I told you, you would see me only as an extension of my father's crimes, rather than as a man who has spent his entire life trying to be nothing like him. I was afraid of losing whatever had begun growing between us before it had even the chance to properly take root. Eleanor felt tears burning behind her eyes, grief and betrayal tangling together into something almost unbearable. I trusted you, she said softly. I let myself believe, for the first time since Edmund died, that perhaps I was allowed to feel something again. And now I do not know whether I have been falling for a man who genuinely cares for me, or simply walking deeper into the shadow of the very family that may have taken everything from me in the first place. Eleanor. Do not, she said, stepping back sharply as he reached toward her. I need time, Damien. I need to think away from this house, away from you, until I understand what is truth and what is simply another carefully constructed arrangement designed to serve your family's interests. She left the library before he could respond further, hurrying up the stairs toward the blue chamber, her mind racing with the terrible possibility that she had allowed herself to fall for the son of the very man who might have destroyed her first chance at happiness. By the time she reached her room, she had already begun instructing Clara to pack her trunk, determined to leave Ravenscourt Hall before dawn, whatever the consequences to their arrangement might be. But as Clara folded the last of Eleanor's gowns into the trunk, a soft knock sounded at the door, followed by a voice Eleanor had not expected to hear again that night. It was not Damien. It was the Dowager Duchess. Lady Ashworth, the old woman said, stepping into the room with surprising steadiness despite her frail health. I believe it is long past time that someone in this house told you the full truth, rather than the fragments my grandson has been too afraid to share. Eleanor turned, startled, uncertain what to expect. The dowager settled slowly into a chair near the window, her expression unusually solemn, stripped entirely of the sharp, testing gaze she had worn since their very first meeting. Sit, child, the dowager said gently. What I am about to tell you, I have carried alone for many years, and I find I no longer have the strength nor the desire to carry it any further." Elinor sat slowly, her heart pounding with a mixture of dread and desperate hope that she might finally receive the answers she had been searching for since the terrible morning she found Edmund collapsed near the stable. "My son," the dowager began, her voice heavy with old grief, "was not a good man, Lady Ashworth. I loved him, as mothers often love their children despite the darkness they carry, but I was not blind to what he was capable of. He ruled this family through fear, and in his final years, that fear turned to something far more dangerous, as he grew desperate to conceal certain financial dealings that would have ruined this family's standing entirely, had they ever come to light." "Edmund discovered something," Elinor said quietly, already understanding where the story was heading. "Your husband was a careful, honest man," the dowager confirmed. "Far too honest, it seems, for my son's liking. He discovered irregularities in the estate's northern accounts, evidence that my son had been quietly diverting funds meant for tenant improvements into his own private holdings for years. Edmund confronted my son directly, demanding the matter be corrected, and threatened to expose the fraud publicly if it was not." Elinor felt her breath catch painfully in her chest, and my son did not respond well to threats. "I do not know precisely what happened," the dowager admitted, her voice trembling with old, unspoken guilt. "I have suspected for years that my son arranged for your husband's silence, though I have never possessed proof enough to accuse him openly, even after his death. I have lived with that suspicion, and that guilt, for 18 long months, Lady Ashworth, and I could not, in good conscience, allow you to leave this house tonight without finally speaking the truth I should have shared with you from the very beginning." Tears slipped freely down Elinor's cheeks now, grief and vindication and fresh anger all tangled together into something she could barely name. "Then it is true," she whispered. "Edmund did not simply collapse. He was silenced because he refused to look away from a wrong he could not, in good conscience, ignore." "I believe so," the dowager said softly. "And I believe my grandson has spent every day since his father's death trying desperately to prove himself nothing like the man responsible, terrified that the world, and perhaps you as well, would judge him guilty simply by association." Elinor thought of Damien's haunted expression whenever the subject of his father arose, of the locked western wing he could not bring himself to enter, of the careful, guarded distance he maintained with everyone around him, and understood, finally, the full weight of the burden he had been carrying entirely alone. "He should have told me the truth from the beginning," Elinor said, though her anger had softened considerably beneath the crushing weight of new understanding. "He should have," the dowager agreed. "Fear rarely makes wise counselors of good men, Lady Ashworth, but I have watched my grandson these past weeks, watched the way his eyes follow you across a room, the way his shoulders ease in your presence for the first time since he was a boy of 17. Whatever mistakes he has made in his silence, I do not believe they came from cruelty. I believe they came from the same fear that has shaped this entire family for far too many years." Elinor sat with the weight of that truth for a long, silent moment, her trunk still half-packed beside her, her heart torn between old grief and a fragile, unexpected hope that perhaps the truth, however painful, might finally allow her to move forward rather than remaining trapped, as she had been for 18 months, beneath the shadow of unanswered questions. Elinor did not leave Ravenscourt Hall that night, though sleep found her only in restless, scattered fragments. By morning she had made a decision. She would not run from the truth, however painful it remained. She would face Damien directly, and together they would decide what to do with the terrible knowledge the dowager had finally shared. She found him in the eastern garden at dawn, standing near the same bare oak tree where Julian had first planted his poisonous suggestions, his shoulders hunched against the cold morning air, his expression carrying the weight of a man who had not slept at all. "My grandmother told me she spoke with you," he said quietly, not turning as Elinor approached. "I imagine you now understand exactly why I feared telling you the truth myself." "I understand your fear," Elinor said, coming to stand beside him. "I do not excuse your silence, Damien. You allowed me to search blindly for answers you already possessed, and that wound will take time to heal, whatever else grows between us. But I understand it." He turned to face her finally, his eyes red-rimmed and raw with an exhaustion that went far deeper than a single sleepless night. "I have spent my entire life terrified of becoming my father," he said. When I learned of the connection between his crimes and your husband's death, I could not bring myself to say the words aloud, because saying them meant accepting that I had brought you into this house not as a partner in a simple arrangement, but as someone connected, however unwillingly, to my family's darkest sins. You are not your father, Elinor said firmly. I have watched you these past weeks, Damien. I have seen the care you show your servants, the gentleness you offered a broken stable boy in the middle of a terrible storm, the guilt you carry for sins that were never yours to carry in the first place. Your father silenced my husband because Edmund refused to look away from wrongdoing. You have spent years trying to uncover that very same wrongdoing at great cost to your own peace. That is not the same man, Damien. That has never been the same man. Something broke open in his expression at her words, relief and grief, and something far more tender all tangled together. I do not deserve your forgiveness so easily given. I have not given it easily, Elinor said softly. I gave it because I have spent 18 months carrying grief and unanswered questions entirely alone, and I find I have no wish to carry them alone any further, if you are willing to help me finally seek the justice Edmund deserved. Before Damien could respond, hurried footsteps sounded on the garden path behind them, and they turned to find Mr. Whitfield, the family's longtime solicitor, approaching with an unusually urgent expression, a thick folder of papers clutched beneath his arm. Your Grace, Whitfield said, slightly breathless, forgive the intrusion, but this cannot wait. Lord Julian Vane has requested an emergency meeting of the family regarding the inheritance to be held this very afternoon. He claims to possess evidence that will prove your engagement to Lady Ashworth entirely fraudulent, and intends to present it before the full family and the presiding magistrate, who he has already summoned from the county seat. Elinor felt her stomach drop. He means to expose us publicly and use the scandal to seize the inheritance for himself. That appears to be precisely his intention, Whitfield confirmed grimly. Damien's expression hardened into something Elinor had not seen since their very first meeting, the cold, formidable resolve that had earned him his fearsome reputation throughout the county. Then we shall meet him this afternoon, and we shall give him considerably more truth than he bargained for. The family gathered that afternoon in the great hall, the same room that had hosted their engagement ball only weeks earlier, though today the atmosphere carried none of that evening's celebratory warmth. The presiding magistrate sat at a formal table near the fireplace, flanked by Whitfield and several distant relations Elinor recognized only vaguely from the ball. The Dowager Duchess sat in her customary high-backed chair, her expression unreadable, though her eyes carried a steely determination that told Elinor she intended to see this confrontation through to its conclusion. Julian arrived precisely on time, dressed impeccably, a folder of his own tucked beneath his arm, his expression carrying the confident satisfaction of a man who believed he had already won. Thank you all for gathering on such short notice, Julian began, addressing the room with practiced charm. I regret the necessity of this meeting, but I could not in good conscience allow this family's inheritance to pass through fraudulent means. I have gathered evidence, over these past weeks, proving that my cousin's engagement to Lady Ashworth is nothing more than a carefully constructed performance, designed to satisfy our late uncle's dying wishes without any genuine intention of marriage behind it. He gestured toward Whitfield, who reluctantly accepted a stack of papers from Julian's outstretched hand. Correspondence between Damien and his solicitor, discussing the arrangement in plain terms, including the specific financial sum offered to Lady Ashworth in exchange for her participation. I obtained these letters through entirely legitimate means, and I believe they speak for themselves. A ripple of shocked murmurs moved through the gathered relatives as Whitfield scanned the letters, his expression grim. Elinor felt her heart pounding, watching the careful arrangement they had built together threaten to collapse entirely under the weight of Julian's carefully assembled evidence. But before the magistrate could speak, before the murmurs could grow into anything more damaging, Damien rose from his chair, his voice carrying clearly across the hall. The letters my cousin has presented are accurate, he said, silencing the room instantly. I will not insult this family nor this court by denying what began as a practical arrangement between myself and Lady Ashworth. Elinor's breath caught, uncertain where his admission was heading, watching Julian's satisfied smile widen at what he clearly believed was Damien's surrender. What my cousin's letters cannot capture, Damien continued, his eyes finding Alina's across the room with an intensity that stole the breath from her lungs, is what that arrangement became in the weeks that followed. I did not anticipate falling in love with the woman I asked to pretend alongside me. I did not anticipate that her courage, her honesty, and her unwavering kindness would undo every careful wall I had built around myself since I was a boy of 17, watching my own family crumble beneath my father's cruelty. The room fell utterly silent, every eye now fixed on Alina, whose own eyes had filled with unexpected tears. I asked Lady Ashworth to pose as my bride, Damien continued, his voice steady despite the vulnerability laid bare in every word. And somewhere in the midst of that pretense, my feelings for her became entirely real without my permission and without any intention of ever informing this family for the sake of an inheritance. If loving her honestly, after beginning dishonestly, constitutes fraud in the eyes of this court, then I confess to it freely, and I will surrender whatever inheritance my cousin believes he deserves rather than deny a single word of what I have just spoken. Julian's confident smile faltered, clearly unprepared for a confession that transformed his carefully planned scandal into something entirely different. Sentiment does not change the facts, Damien. An engagement built on deception, regardless of what it later became, remains fraudulent by its very nature. Perhaps, Damien allowed, but I would remind this court that fraud requires intent to deceive for personal gain that harms another party. Lady Ashworth received nothing from our arrangement she did not honestly need, and this family has lost nothing through our engagement that was ever rightfully yours to claim, Julian, whatever your ambitions may suggest otherwise. The magistrate, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke, his expression thoughtful. Lord Vane, do you possess any evidence beyond these letters suggesting genuine financial harm to this family's interests, resulting from the engagement in question? Julian hesitated, clearly caught without a satisfactory answer. The harm lies in the deception itself, in the manipulation of a dying woman's final wishes for. I am neither dying nor manipulated, the Dowager Duchess interrupted sharply, rising slowly from her chair, her voice carrying surprising strength across the hall. I have watched my grandson and Lady Ashworth these past weeks with my own eyes, and whatever began as pretense between them transformed, quite genuinely, into something far more honest than most marriages arranged entirely for proper reasons ever managed to achieve. I will not stand by while my nephew attempts to weaponize my own dying wish against the very happiness that wish was meant to secure. Alina watched Julian's composure crumble further with every word, his careful scheme unraveling before the entire assembled family, his ambitions laid bare for exactly what they had always been. The magistrate cleared his throat, addressing the room with quiet finality. Absent evidence of genuine financial harm, and given the Dowager Duchess's direct testimony regarding the current state of the engagement, I see no grounds for contesting the inheritance on the basis presented today. Lord Vane, I would advise considerable caution before pursuing similarly unsubstantiated claims in the future. Julian stood frozen for a long moment, humiliation and fury warring visibly across his face, before he finally gathered his scattered papers and stormed from the great hall without another word, his scheme entirely and publicly defeated. The room slowly returned to hushed, astonished conversation, though Alina barely registered any of it, her eyes fixed entirely on Damien, who crossed the hall toward her without hesitation, uncaring of the many eyes still watching. I meant every word, he said quietly, stopping before her, close enough that she could see the raw vulnerability still lingering in his eyes. I did not plan to say it in front of the entire family, but I find I have grown tired of hiding truths that deserve to be spoken plainly. Alina felt tears slipping freely down her cheeks now, joy and relief and something far deeper tangling together into an emotion she had not allowed herself to feel fully since Edmund's death. I meant what I said as well, she whispered, though I confess I never quite managed to say it aloud until this very moment. I love you, Damien. Somewhere between the storms and the secrets and the careful pretense, I fell in love with you entirely. The great hall erupted into surprised applause from the gathered relatives, and Damien, uncaring of propriety, uncaring of anything beyond the woman standing before him, gathered Alina gently into his arms, the last remaining walls between pretense and truth finally, completely dissolved. In the weeks that followed, Ravenscourt Hall began, slowly and unmistakably, to feel less like a house shadowed by old grief, and more like a home learning tentatively how to breathe again. The servants no longer glanced nervously toward the western wing, for Damien had finally, with Alina beside him, opened its locked door and stood within it for the first time in years, facing the portrait of his mother and the weight of memories he had spent a lifetime avoiding. "I do not know if I can ever fully forgive him," Damien admitted quietly, standing beside Alina in that once forbidden room, dust motes drifting through pale afternoon light. "But I find I no longer wish to let his shadow decide who I am allowed to become." Alina took his hand, steady and warm. "Then let us decide together instead." Justice for Edmund arrived slowly, through careful investigation rather than dramatic revelation. Whitfield uncovered enough surviving evidence among the old estate ledgers to establish, beyond reasonable doubt, the late Duke's fraudulent dealings and the payment made shortly before Edmund's death. Though the man directly responsible for that final, terrible night had died years earlier, the truth itself brought Alina a peace she had not known she was still searching for. She visited Edmund's grave one final time before winter set in, laying flowers upon the frozen ground, and finally allowed herself to say goodbye properly, no longer haunted by unanswered questions. Julian left the county entirely within the month, his reputation too damaged by his public humiliation to remain welcome among the families whose good opinion he had always depended upon. The Dowager Duchess lived considerably longer than the 2 months her physicians had once predicted, her health improving steadily alongside her evident delight in watching her grandson finally choose happiness over fear. Damien proposed properly on a crisp morning in early winter, kneeling beside the same bare oak tree in the eastern garden, where Alina had once faced Julian's cruel accusations, transforming the sight of old pain into something entirely new and hopeful. "I once told you," he said, holding her hands gently in his own, "that whatever passed between us was not meant to be real. I find myself grateful every single day since, that I was entirely and completely wrong." Alina laughed through happy tears, kneeling to meet him at eye level rather than allowing him to remain below her. "Then let us be wrong together, Damien, for the rest of our lives." Their wedding, when it finally arrived the following spring, filled Ravenscourt Hall with a warmth its old stone walls had not known in generations. The Dowager Duchess stood proudly at the front of the small gathering. Clara wept happy tears from her place among the honored guests, and even the servants, no longer whispering fearful rumors about their master, smiled openly as Damien and Alina exchanged vows that carried nothing false within them. The most feared duke in the county, it turned out, had never truly been feared at all, once someone finally took the time to look past the careful walls he had built to protect a heart that had simply been waiting, all along, for someone brave enough to help him tear them down. And the widow who had once believed her own capacity for love buried alongside her first husband discovered, in the quiet, steady warmth of Ravenscourt Hall, that love, once truly lost, could still find its way home again, when given the courage to stop pretending and simply let itself be real.